What springs to mind when you think of a ghost story? Perhaps figures draped in white sheets, a forest shrouded in mist, a dark house with creaky floorboards. Like many genres, there is a set of specific tropes and techniques that are associated with the ghost story, leading us to conjure images like the ones I just mentioned. It's somewhat predictable, but it instills a general feeling of fear and terror as we anxiously await the threat of the unknown. We'll begin to doubt the sanity of the main character, slowly creating suspense through the imagined possibilities and endless dangers that await them. But can we always be so sure of what we're seeing? Over the years, there have been a number of ghost stories that don't belong to the horror genre, yet still use similar techniques to allude to the supernatural, creating something far more realistic, but perhaps even more terrifying. Through the subversion of classic horror tropes, the image of the ghost has in some cases evolved into a symbol of loss or unfulfilled love, with characters being haunted by memories or things they regret. By merging the language of horror and heartbreak, a subgenre of unconventional ghost stories has emerged, with ghosts either being explicitly referenced in the absence of a lost love, or with techniques from traditional ghost stories being used to create a sense of longing for someone that isn't really there. Often the audience is lured in by the false promise of romance, only to be trapped in a whirlwind of sorrow and desperate yearning, with heartache becoming likened to horror and synonymous with death. By exploring the ways in which these tropes are subverted, we can begin to see the unexpected films that fit into this category, and the chilling middle ground that exists between ghost stories and unresolved flings, breakups, and situationships. These unconventional ghost stories can be split into two categories: romance with explicit ghosts or romance with implicit ghosts. In the first category, films like Portrait of a Lady on Fire and All of Us Strangers contain explicit references to ghosts, while some of these ghosts take on more abstract forms, such as Heloise in a wedding dress in Portrait of a Lady on Fire. These films merge the language of horror and heartbreak through a physical manifestation of the character's longing for a love that is slipping from their grasp. This highlights the genuine horror of watching someone you love become as evasive as a ghost, likening the process of heartbreak to death, being haunted by the memory of someone you can't be with. But films about romantic love that have implied references to ghosts are much more interesting. In the Mood for Love, Past Lives, and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, the directors use subtle horror tropes to add an overall sense of pining for a love that no longer exists, with the characters slowly resembling ghosts as they search for a lost romance. For some, the characters are stuck in a time loop and the ghost is trapped within a specific place, haunted by the memories of a space and time in which they were with the person they loved. In Last Year at Marion Bad, In the Mood for Love, and Millennium Mambo, the story almost entirely takes place in a single location, and the audience feels trapped in this setting due to the character's lack of physical agency, creating an otherworldly feeling as they drift along with no sense of moving forward, trapped in the past. Old love makes a ghost out of these people, haunting a place that once connected them to those they loved. In Carol, Past Lives, and In the Mood for Love, the use of long musical sequences and slow motion also helps to build a ghost-like world that slowly detaches us from reality. These moments serve to heighten the all-consuming, disconnected world of the characters that are in love, becoming ghostly reflections of themselves as they occupy another realm, with no sound to ground them in the real world. Another way this is achieved is through abstract and surreal narrative details that alienate the characters from the world around them, sometimes leaving them unable to distinguish between real life and dreams, such as in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and Her. Small details of their worlds are distorted to varying degrees, likening the character to a supernatural entity as the edges of their reality starts to fray, almost as though they are no longer alive. The crumbling house in Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, or the strange mix of dreams and flashbacks in Her, frame the characters as ghost-like people, not belonging to the real world, or at least no world we're familiar with. Sometimes the characters begin to slip from our very sight through the use of visual techniques such as soft focus and extreme wide shots, distancing or perhaps shielding us from their inner world. We find ourselves unable to grow closer to the character, almost as if they don't exist, and because of this, we are unable to see them clearly or in true detail. Sometimes this technique becomes increasingly obvious towards the end of the film, with the characters slowly fading into oblivion, melting into their surroundings as they lose their grip on reality, absorbed by the intensity of their inner world and a love that consumes them. Despite the apparent romanticism of the stories, they're really more about loss than anything else, with a thin veil of optimism that hides their eerie core. While many traditional ghost stories are rooted in fantasy and surrealism, This subgenre heightens our fear by grounding the threat in something very real. We can detach ourselves from the less relatable problems we see in horror movies of living in a haunted mansion or being stalked by translucent figures, but when faced with the cruel reality of past lives or eternal sunshine of the spotless mind, it's harder to separate the story from our own lived experiences. Maybe we find it easier to switch off when watching traditional ghost stories. It's a form of escapism, after all. We can be swept up in the gore and jump scares and completely immerse ourselves in an enjoyable level of fear. But when faced with the memory of an old flame or lost love that just happens to manifest in the same form, it is no longer a form of escapism. It becomes confrontational. Every prolonged glance and lingering touch begins to burn into us, reminding us of our own memories and heartaches, a touch that can never be felt or a person who can no longer be seen. Sometimes the right person can exist in the wrong world, and an old love will make a ghost out of you, haunted in your search of someone who is fading from your world entirely.